Joined by Solomon Elamimian, Adrian Tracy, and Nick Arbuckle on our CFL Roundtable. And the topic is racism for obvious reasons, gentlemen. And Solomon, we'll start with you as the head of the CFL Players Association. Just what do you go through emotionally when you see some of the demonstrations we've been seeing in the last 10 days to 2 weeks on both sides of the border?
It's definitely inspiring. And one thing that I'm, pleasantly surprised about is just the, amount of young people, the amount of people from all races, not just Black. And I know me and Adrian talked, earlier, and, growing up from inner city Los Angeles, we had a lot of protesting a lot of times when, violence was done, acts of police brutality was done, but it just always seemed like it was just Black people protesting. And we never got to a place where the question of how do we change, where do we go from now was answered. But now with all the demonstration and protesting from all races coming together and seeing, how can we enact change? So it's been very inspiring.
I agree. Then the biggest difference is that people who don't look like me are beginning to empathize and actually take action as opposed to sympathize and spectate. And that's huge. I was able to participate in the protest downtown Hamilton at Gore Park. And one of the biggest things that I could appreciate really was a sign that I read held by a white woman that said, "I'm a Black mother before I'm a white woman." And I think that it showed the fact that her kids, who were mixed and primarily recognized as being African American, came first. They were her priority.
Yeah, and I think one of the most beautiful things is that the protests have happened in all 50 states across the U.S. and in other countries as well around the world. And I think that's so important because it really does, racism and oppression and injustice really exists everywhere. And growing up in, a white suburban neighborhood in Southern California, I didn't really know that growing up, and I didn't experience anything like that. And it wasn't until I kind of branched out and created, friends and relationships with other cultures and, moved into Georgia that I saw, the significance of the racism things that exist around the world. And now being in Canada, I see that it's not just a U.S. problem.
Let's ask you all about your upbringing and racism that you've endured. And we'll start with when you were younger in the United States. And just, we hear the examples of police brutality and systematic oppression and things like that. I mean, let's start with you, Adrian. I mean, what experiences did you have growing up that make you relate to what you're seeing?
Personally, police brutality, no, but I've definitely been profiled. It was actually my older friend, who was about a year older, got his license before everybody else. So of course we're excited. We're just driving around. He was Indian, I'm African American, and the third person in the car was Vietnamese. And we got pulled over. And upon getting pulled over, it being the first time we were in that situation, we didn't really know how to react. So we're abiding and we're listening, but just the atmosphere and how it was just heavy, how we were being treated, requested to get out the car, asked if there's any drugs, any weapons, and then proceeded to get frisked and patted down. And actually, it's funny to laugh at now, but it wasn't then. I actually had a pack of fruit snacks in my pocket, and he thought that they were drugs or they were something illegal. And he just continued to berate me about that. And I told him, "Sir, if you reach in my pocket, you'll clearly see that it's fruit snacks." And he actually went ahead and did so. And the look on his face of it was like shock, but at the same time for me, it was disappointment and hurt because he tried to pan me out to be somebody who I wasn't. My mom didn't raise me to be that individual. And I had tried so hard all the way up until that point to abide by what I thought was the right way, not to be perceived as that. But regardless of my actions in school, regardless of my stellar athletic ability, that was not recognized in that moment. It was the fact that I was a Black kid in America.
Similar to Adrian, I was with my best friend. We was driving. He was driving, I was riding in the passenger side, and we get stopped. And the police stopped us, and, they got the guns drawn out. We get out the car, they handcuff us, they rough us up, and they search through the car, looking for drugs, looking for, maybe guns and things like that. And I just felt, hopelessness. I felt, trauma. I was angry. And I'll never forget, I remember turning to my best friend who was sitting next to me. And I just, I'm like, this is BS, man. They can't do this. And he gave a reaction I'll never forget. He kind of smirked, and he said, "So, they're the police. They can do whatever they want." Like Nick said, he grew up in a small town. It was something he didn't really see blatantly. But for me and Adrian, we seen it clear as day. But also by us sharing our stories, is therapeutic, because it's a trauma that I have to deal with, and I'm sure he has to deal with, to say, you know what, not all people, not all police officers, not all people are like that, but somewhere along the line, this was a learned behavior, and that's what we have to attack.
Nick, for you, as Saul mentioned, you didn't go through a lot of this as a youngster. You grew up in a predominantly white suburb about 45 minutes outside of Los Angeles, but much like myself, you're involved in an interracial marriage, and you know, your wife is African American. When you heard the stories from her, how difficult was it to digest and accept that something you couldn't potentially relate to at that point was something she had to deal with firsthand?
Ever since we first met, it was something kind of we started talking about, because it was something that when I first got to Georgia, I didn't really have a good grasp of or feel of. To me, it was still the idea of racism, especially kind of open racism, was not something I ever heard about or really knew existed. It was something that was never taught to me in my family. It was something I didn't really learn about in school. What I did learn about in school was a super whitewashed version of slavery, and you know, made it feel like all the injustice and oppression that Black people suffered in this country was of ancient history, and that didn't exist anymore. And I didn't know any better. I didn't experience anything personally, nor did I really know anybody who did. So when I got to Georgia and I started experiencing what it was like as, to be an African American in the South and in the Southeast United States, it was different. Just talking to my wife, she told me her first experience with racism was when she was 5 years old on the playground in Florida. And one of her friends came up to her at school and said that she wasn't allowed to play with her anymore on the playground because her dad said that she wasn't allowed to play with Black people because Black people were dirty. And so I'm just kind of hearing that from my wife. And even when she told me about it yesterday again, and you can see kind of the pain and the hurt that's in her eyes when she shares those kind of moments. And those are things that I can never relate to, but I know that there's things that I'm going to have to prepare my daughter for. And as she grows older, because she's going to experience things that I've never had to experience. I had the privilege of being on the outside of. And I feel like that ignorance that I had growing up shouldn't be allowed to exist, because that's how these things continue to be a problem in society today. So it's hurtful to see these things happen and to hear about these things happening. But I feel like there's so many things that we still need to do as a country and as a world to help, abolish these things and change the way people think and the way people treat each other.
You use the term privilege, and we hear that term a lot now, because it's not just the police brutality piece, but it's also the systematic racism and oppression piece. And a lot of that sometimes gets tied into the concept of white privilege. When you look back at your upbringing, was that you?
100%. Not just from the ability to have ignorance to what goes on, but some of the things that I was able to get away with as a kid. Like when I was, I think in 4th or 5th grade, and I was at a daycare program at school, I threw an orange and hit a police car that was driving on the road on the street. And I hit them in the windshield and they almost crashed. And they turned around and came back, saw that it was somebody at our school, and they eventually found out that it was me that threw it. And the police just kind of talked to me, told me what could have happened and how bad it was, and told me not to do anything like that again. And I didn't really get in trouble. Nothing happened to me, and who knows how that could have played out of, throwing something and hitting a police car while I was driving, no matter how old you are, how that could have turned out if I wasn't who I am or looked the way I do. And so, and there's been other instances where there's no doubt I've been able to get away with doing things, and just my interactions that I have had with police have always been positive. And I've never felt threatened. I've never felt like I had to treat or act a certain way so that I wouldn't get shot or wouldn't get assaulted. And those are things I never had to think about or worry about, or didn't even know that people had to think about those things until I got older, until I see all the injustices that happen in our world today.
Guys, it seems how you interact with police seems to be everything in this situation. What conversations did you have with your parents about potentially having to deal with police?
I was always taught to treat people in positions of authority with respect. And in regards to police officers, it was to make them feel more comfortable than necessary, to make them feel like they're in a safe environment, and that they're not dealing with somebody who would incite an issue, not only for their sake, but more so mine, just so that I can make it home. So for me personally, like, make sure your hands are visible. If you get pulled over in a car, make sure that you have your identification and everything already in a visible spot, so they don't think that you're doing something to incite them to pull for their weapon.
And similar to Adrian, you know, just conversations of always complying. And I guess the hardest part, even when you're a kid, is even when you're not doing nothing wrong, even when you're innocent, even when they look at you as a criminal, you have to comply because you want to make it home, you know, at night. And I remember watching the Rodney King beating in '92. And my question, to my dad was, what did he do wrong? And why is there so many people beating on this man? And you know what, from his answer was like, you know, because you're seen as a threat, even when you're not a threat. So it's all about, you know, like Adrian says, carrying yourself in a way where, you know what, you have to maybe swallow your pride, but over comply. And, you know, it's one where you kind of learn the lessons from the streets.
For me, I mean, I think my conversation that my parents had with me is kind of like the epitome of white privilege, because I was told how to interact with police in order to avoid getting a ticket. Because if you were being polite enough and you were being really courteous and open and friendly, you might just get off with a warning. So that's where my teaching of how to interact with police came from. Like, that was the purpose of it, not to avoid looking like a threat or to avoid, you know, having something done to me, but just because they might think I'm so nice and friendly that they might not want to give me a ticket, even though I was speeding 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, which worked. I mean, I've been able to get off tickets, and you know, get warnings because of my privilege and because of, you know, the things that I'm able to do just because of the way I look. And that's not how society should work. And that's something that I felt was normal when I was a kid growing up because I didn't know anything better. But instances like that make me wonder how people in the world still think that white privilege doesn't exist, or that injustices based on the way based on your skin color, you know, don't exist.
Adrian, I know here in Canada, there's a general belief that we don't have that level of racism, at least directed towards blacks in our country, but yet you see a number of protests. What have your experiences been like regarding racism in Canada?
Here in Canada, racism isn't overt. It's not out in the open blatantly like it is in the States, but it definitely does exist. A few weeks ago, this is pre-COVID, pre-coronavirus and social distancing. I was walking down in my neighborhood, and a white lady was walking in the same direction, opposite direction on the same side of the sidewalk. And she grabbed her bag and pulled it close. But as we got closer, she then felt the need to cross the street. She crossed the street, and in my head, I'm thinking, like, this is not happening. Like, this is 2020. There's no way. It's daylight. Like, I'm not looking like a menacing individual that this is, like, literally happening in front of me. And so my curiosity as to, like, why she would really cross the street peaked. And so I turned around after she had crossed, and when she felt like, I guess, she was a safe distance away, she returned to the same side of the sidewalk that I was on, and continued on her way. It was, I guess, laughable from the standpoint of, like, wow, we're still in 2020 and dealing with things of this magnitude. But it was very disheartening for me because, like I said, I was viewed as somebody who I was not.
When I talk about systemic racism and my experience in U.S., it's been different in Canada. Yes, I've been stopped before in Canada for, you know, I think it's racial profiling, but I never felt my life was threatened. Even when I go back to States now, when I get pulled over, I can feel my heartbeat through my chest because I've seen those videos. I've seen, you know, black men, you know, get killed, and that thing is traumatic. And, you know, I remember an incident that happened, you know, when I played in with the BC Lions, and we had a group of guys get pulled over by the facility. And, you know, me, Wally, you know, that's my guy, and we talk, you know, about a lot of different things. And that was one thing he brought up. You know, he said, guys, you know, you guys got to stop being jerks to the police officer. Just be nice to them. And it was one of the most uncomfortable meetings we've ever had because the players was like, wow, we did nothing wrong. Like, we got stopped for just being Black. And you could see the tension in there because a lot of Black people understood what those guys were saying and got stopped by those police officers. And for Wally, he says, oh, it was a learning experience for me because, man, I didn't know that. I didn't grow up, having to deal with those things. So that's why I think these conversations are needed because, there is a gap that needs to be bridged. One where, victims have experienced it. We need to be able to, let that out and talk about it and help that trauma, but also the people that haven't, really went through it. They want to be able to understand and help. And that's one thing that I'm committed to doing as CFLPA president. I know me and Adrian has talked and, we formed the working group is how can we enact change?
Everybody wants to see change. What does change look like and how do you get there? What needs to happen?
Well, honestly, for me, I think this is something that's needed, this conversation, hearing Nick talk about his wife and her first experience as a 5-year-old youth, being told that she can't play with her friends because Black people are dirty. That brought tears to my eyes. But are these conversations, do they happen on a regular? Mm-hmm. I don't think so, but I think that's the first step. Let's be honest with ourselves. Let's be honest with how we treat each other. And let's be honest with where do we learn these thoughts? Where do we learn the fact that, Black people are less than other people or, indigenous people are less than other people. And that's one thing that I've been trying to do is understand the plight of the First Nations. And I think education is important to bring awareness similar to, the breast cancer. What we do when we bring awareness of things that affect our society is have a conversation, how we can help, but more importantly, how can we create an avenue where we can affect change? And that is what I think that we'll be doing. It's not an overnight thing, but it's something that I'm excited to be working on. And I think that, we have some really good ideas. Tracy's part of that group to, use the CFL players as the voice, the vehicle to, tell our stories where a lot of these guys come from, whether it's in Toronto, Brampton, or whether it's in Crenshaw, or whether, throughout the States. Let's tell our stories, but more importantly, let's make sure that we're part of the solution. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people, want to find is how can I help?
No, that's very true. And like Sally said, we've had conversations between him and myself personally, but then, like I said, with the committee as a whole. And I think we have the general just premise of acknowledging that there's an issue first and foremost. Like you said, there's a lot of people specifically in Canada that don't believe it's an issue. And it may not be overt, but it's definitely there. It's definitely present. The second thing I think we have to do is just commit to change. Like we've acknowledged that it's there. Now we got to commit to changing and actually put things in place that allow us to not just talk about it, but be about it, and commit to that transformation. In my opinion, it needs to start with the grassroots. Like we've all said, nobody on this planet is the father of racism, but yet it still exists. So that means that it's been learned over time. It's been just ingrained. And so, in my opinion, starting like we said, we have a beautiful example in Nate's daughter, starting young and letting them know, like, just because that person's skin color is different than yours doesn't mean that they're dirty. Like, that just means that they're of a different area, different background, different nationality that brings different things to the table that you might even appreciate, that you might even be able to glean off of and add to a part of who you are. I think on a larger level, like, there's got to be government implementation. I think through the conversation that you and I had as we were just kind of briefing Farhan, we mentioned the property tax and how that is very disparaging in both regards. Like, it's unfortunate that the areas in which African American communities are at are below par. Like, not a lot of people want to live there. So if you tax those, they're obviously going to bring in less money than you would a more affluent, predominantly white area, who then gets the benefit of those taxes that get re-implemented into the school and education system, in which they're learning things that allow them to establish a legacy. Which is why I wore this shirt, is because I don't think that, actually, that's not, I don't think, I know that Black people are not a threat to lives, we're a threat to legacies. If we are equipped with the same tools and the same opportunities, with the same foundation as our human equal counterparts, I think we can establish ourselves a strong foothold in the world, as we already have, without having those things. So the last thing I would say is to sustain that. Like, once we have it in place, once we acknowledge what it is that we're doing, it's now our job to continue to sustain it. There's got to be a model that can be duplicated. It can be passed down from generation to generation, that it's not just a flash in the pan, because this is something that, as you can see, everybody on here is completely passionate about. and everybody on here has different backgrounds, and we're only 4 people.
Yeah, and I think we have to continue, like Solomon said and Tracy said, like these kind of conversations have to continue happening, and we have to continue to do everything we can to spread awareness of what's going on, and because people shouldn't be able to grow up like I did. Like if you're not, just because you're not around a diverse community and you're not experiencing these kind of problems firsthand, doesn't mean you shouldn't be taught about these things. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be aware that these kind of things happen in the world, so that you can grow up wanting and willing to make a difference. So you know there is something to change, because you can't create change if you aren't even aware of something that's wrong or something that needs to be changed. And I think today, with what's going on with the protests and with these kind of conversations that we're having, and also just social media in general nowadays, I feel is such a great avenue to be able to spread information and spread awareness unlike ever before to the masses. And so I feel like using our platforms as professional athletes and using our platforms just of having a voice that can be heard, that can be retweeted, that can be shared and spread to people who might not be able to see us or hear us firsthand, I think is really important.
Nick, what message, as you talk about messaging, will you eventually give to your daughter? Like, do you want her to know that you did something to make a difference in all of this? I'll use the example of Serena Williams. I know you used to have a crush on her now. We won't get into that. But her husband, who was the CEO of Reddit, decided to resign so that his position could go to an African-American. Like, do you feel the need with a mixed-race daughter to be able to explain to her that not only is it wrong from my perspective, but here's what I did to fix it?
Obviously, what's going on in the year 2020 is going to be in the history books. Everything that's happened today, from the pandemic of the COVID virus to the pandemic of racism that's finally being brought to the forefront with all of the protests and things that are going on now. These are things that people are going to be learning about, for years to come. So I want to be able to make sure that I'm in a position where I can say that I did something and that I did my part to help people, and not just so I can tell my daughter that, or that I can say, hey, like I did something, but so that I can hopefully create change. I feel like God blessed me with a platform to be able to speak and reach people that I might not have been able to reach a year ago or 2 years ago. Not many people would have known my name or cared to listen to what I had to say, but hopefully now I'm in a position where I can, create more change, and people can listen to what I say and the things I have to say. Not just my daughter, but everyone.
You go back to 2016, Colin Kaepernick takes a knee, and he was roundly criticized, and now he's completely being upheld as the model of peaceful protest. I know many people believe it's the virus just forcing us to stare at this and not be distracted. Adrian, we'll start with you. Why now is it the right time for change and messages are being heard?
People have had enough. Like, enough is enough. When you continue to see, regardless of whether it's a Republican president or a Democratic president or whatever's happening, a rainy day, a sunny day, it's still something that's consistently happening. And it's still something that needs to be addressed. And finally, people are in a position, like they said, we have people who are in positions of power with independent platforms that can push their own message, their own story. And a lot of those stories are finally being connected to with other people from different circles who are like, okay, I don't look like him or I don't look like her, but I can feel exactly that pain that they have. I can feel where they're coming from.
Yeah, like I said, once I penned my message to our players and asking them to speak out and use their platforms to, speak about this issue, I immediately reached out to Randy, and I want to thank him because he responded back immediately, and he said, this is an issue that they're committed to working with the players on, and I think that like Adrian says, it needs to be something that's grassroots, but also something that's led by the players, because our players feel very passionate about it, and they can lend their voices to speak out on this issue. And I feel like there's very, very creative ways to do this. And I've been very, thankful for our players chiming in and having different ideas of how we can bring awareness, how we can bring information, but how we can be a vehicle to change. This is something that we can create a program that we can create that's, long lasting, that's able to sustain, but, essentially affect change. And the CFL is committed to doing that, and the CFLPA is committed to doing that. But I think the more important thing is we need to make sure it's done right, and we need to make sure it's done, in a way where it outlives us, and people can say, the CFL did its part to affect change